reporter laughs during a live news broadcast, but this was no joke. She laughed because China had just issued a warning, not only to America, but directly to Donald Trump. A warning that echoed across the globe. China said, "Stop spreading confusing information." And that statement stood in direct contradiction to Trump's own claims. Were trade talks really happening? Or was the American public being misled? Today, we uncover every layer of this story, because this wasn't just a trade war. It was a collision between lies and the truth. Reporter laughs while revealing China's warning to Trump about confusing information. In the fast-paced world of international politics, even the smallest moment can reveal something much larger beneath the surface. That's exactly what happened during a live MSNBC news broadcast, when a reporter burst into a brief but telling laugh. The topic? China's growing frustration with then-President Donald Trump's handling of US-China trade talks. While the moment lasted only a few seconds, it spoke volumes about the confusion, contradictions, and chaos surrounding one of the most important geopolitical relationships in the world. The segment began like many others, with MSNBC anchor Alex Witt asking a field reporter about the latest developments between China and the United States. The context was the escalating trade war, an economic conflict sparked by Trump's repeated imposition of tariffs on Chinese goods. The president had claimed that negotiations were ongoing and even suggested that he had spoken directly with Chinese President Xi Jinping. But what came next shocked many viewers. As the reporter prepared to explain China's official response, she couldn't help but laugh, a small chuckle, an amused grin, and then delivered the statement, "China's ministry has said that if the US wants to start negotiations, they need to do away with these unilateral tariffs." She continued, "They've also said that the US needs to stop putting out confusing information and misleading people into thinking that these negotiations are happening." The moment was brief, but striking. A journalist laughing during a segment about an international trade dispute. It wasn't mockery, it was disbelief. Because what China was saying publicly was in stark contrast to what Trump was claiming at home. To understand the weight of that moment, we need to go back to the roots of the US-China trade conflict. Throughout his presidency, Donald Trump embraced a tough stance against China, accusing the country of unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and currency manipulation. He framed the conflict as a patriotic fight, America versus a cheating competitor, and his weapon of choice, tariffs, billions of dollars worth of them. Trump used tariffs as both punishment and leverage, hoping to force China to the negotiating table. And when questions arose about whether talks were happening or not, he assured the public that negotiations were underway. But that was the problem. The actual status of those negotiations was unclear, and China was no longer willing to quietly tolerate the confusion. In an unusual move, China's Ministry of Commerce issued a blunt statement, rejecting the notion that meaningful negotiations were taking place. They accused the US government of spreading confusing information, and made it clear that talks could only resume if the US first removed its unilateral tariffs. For a country known for its calculated and cautious diplomacy, this was a bold statement, and it showed just how fed up China was becoming with Trump's contradictory messages. Meanwhile, Trump continued to insist that conversations with China were ongoing. He even claimed to have spoken with President Xi. But journalists and analysts quickly pointed out that no recent communication had occurred since the latest round of tariffs went into effect. This created a troubling disconnect. On one side, the President of the United States was telling the American people that trade talks were alive and well. On the other side, China was publicly saying, no, they're not. For investors, companies, and ordinary citizens caught in the middle of a trade war, this kind of misinformation had serious consequences. Markets respond not just to actions, but to words. Stock prices can soar or crash based on a single tweet. In this case, Trump's vague and conflicting statements about trade talks caused massive uncertainty. Farmers in the Midwest, American manufacturers, tech companies, and even retail chains were already struggling with the fallout from the trade war. Now, with China calling out the confusion, it became even harder for the American public to know what was real and what wasn't. That's why the reporter's laugh became such a viral moment. It wasn't just about the words being said. It was about the absurdity of the entire situation. Here was one of the world's largest economic powers essentially telling the American president, "Stop lying, stop misleading your people." And the media, often caught in the crossfire between political spin and public truth, had no choice but to highlight that contradiction, even if it meant reacting with a moment of stunned laughter. For years, China had taken a measured approach when dealing with the US under Trump. They avoided public confrontations and responded diplomatically to aggressive American moves. But by this point in the trade war, their patience was wearing thin. Chinese officials saw Trump's unpredictability and misinformation as a strategic threat, and their message was no longer subtle. They were calling it out, point blank, on the international stage. This moment didn't just make headlines in the US. It caught the attention of global leaders. Countries across Europe, Asia, and the Americas were watching how the US-China conflict would unfold. Would it end in compromise, collapse, or further confusion? For many, China's statement was a sign that even patient, calculated nations have their limits, and that when pushed too far, they will speak out, openly and clearly. In the midst of all this, one question loomed large. Who should the American people believe? Their president, who claimed victory and progress in the trade war, or foreign diplomats and economists who said otherwise? The contradiction between public narrative and private reality had become too obvious to ignore. And that's where the media came in, not just to report, but to analyze, question, and expose the truth behind the headlines. The laughter from the reporter may have been small, but it was symbolic. It captured what many people were thinking, that the political messaging from the White House had become so disconnected from reality that even professionals were finding it difficult to deliver with a straight face. And in that brief moment, the laughter said what diplomacy could not. In the end, China's warning wasn't just a criticism of Trump. It was a message to all nations that truth in diplomacy matters, that trust cannot be built on confusion, and that in the world of international negotiation, clarity is not optional, it's essential. As time moved on, the trade war continued to evolve, but that moment remained a clear turning point. It was a signal that the world was watching, that misinformation could not go unchecked, and that even global superpowers have limits to their patience. So, what comes next? That's the question many are still asking. The story of the US-China trade war isn't over, but this chapter, marked by a laugh, a warning, and a clash between spin and reality, will be remembered as a powerful reminder of what happens when truth gets lost in translation.